I never thought a pile of snow would turn into a legal nightmare. But when the HOA sent me a $200 fine for where I'd placed it in my own driveway, I knew things were about to get interesting. My name is Franklin Morrison, and I've lived in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision in Denver, Colorado, for 3 years. It's one of those cookie-cutter neighborhoods where every house looks almost identical. The lawns are measured with rulers, and the HOA president has nothing better to do than patrol the streets looking for violations. That president's name was Patricia Whitmore, and she was exactly what you'd picture when someone says, HOA Karen. Mid-40s, bottle blonde hair that she wore in that "I want to speak to the manager, Bob," and a perpetual scowl that suggested she'd been sucking on lemons since birth. The whole mess started on a Tuesday morning in early January. Colorado had been slammed with one of the worst blizzards in recent memory. Nearly 2 feet of snow had fallen over 3 days, and the entire city was buried under a thick white blanket. I'd spent 4 hours that morning with my snowblower, clearing my driveway and sidewalk. By the time I finished, my back was killing me. My fingers were numb despite my gloves, and I had a massive pile of snow sitting at the edge of my driveway, right where the concrete met my front lawn. It seemed perfectly reasonable to me. The snow was on my property, not blocking the sidewalk or the street. I'd done everything by the book, or so I thought. I went inside, made myself a hot coffee, and collapsed on the couch, thinking I'd earned a peaceful afternoon. That peace lasted exactly 45 minutes. The doorbell rang with that aggressive, rapid-fire pattern that immediately told me something was wrong. I opened the door to find Patricia standing there, dressed in a puffy white coat that made her look like the Michelin Man, holding a clipboard and wearing an expression that could freeze hell over. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice dripping with barely contained irritation. "I need to speak with you about your snow removal." I blinked at her, still half frozen myself. "What about it?" "Your snow pile is in direct violation of Section 7.3, Paragraph B of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA bylaws." She flipped through papers on her clipboard with theatrical efficiency. "All snow removed from driveways must be placed in designated areas that do not interfere with the aesthetic uniformity of the neighborhood." "Patricia, it's a pile of snow on the edge of my driveway. It'll melt in a few days." "The bylaws are clear, Mr. Morrison. The snow pile creates an unsightly appearance and violates our community standards." She handed me a bright yellow piece of paper. "This is your official violation notice. You have 24 hours to relocate the snow to an approved location, or you'll be fined $200. I stared at the paper, then at her, then back at the paper. "You're fining me for snow that fell from the sky on my own property." "The location of the snow pile is the violation, not the snow itself," she said, as if explaining basic math to a child. "I suggest you read the bylaws more carefully in the future. Good day, Mr. Morrison." She turned and marched back to her black SUV, leaving me standing in my doorway holding a violation notice for snow placement. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I'd lived through plenty of Patricia's petty complaints before my garbage cans were supposedly visible from the street for 15 minutes longer than allowed. My grass was once measured and found to be 3.5 inches tall instead of the required 3 inches, and I'd been written up for having my car parked in my driveway facing the wrong direction. But this was a new level of absurdity. I went back inside and actually looked up Section 7.3, Paragraph B in the HOA bylaws. Sure enough, there it was, buried in page 47 of the 70-page document. All snow and ice removed from driveways and walkways must be placed in rear yard areas, or other locations not visible from street view to maintain community aesthetic standards. The problem was, my backyard was completely fenced in, and there was no way to get snow back there without either throwing it over the fence by hand, shovelful by shovelful, or dragging it through my house. Neither option was remotely reasonable, especially with 2 feet of snow. I called my neighbor Greg, who lived 2 houses down. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding tired. "Hey, Franklin, please tell me you're calling about something that doesn't involve the HOA." "I wish I could," I said. "Did Patricia hit you up about snow placement too?" "Oh yeah. She came by an hour ago. I told her exactly where she could put her violation notice, and it wasn't in an HOA-approved location." He laughed, but it was bitter. "I'm not moving my snow. What's she going to do, arrest me? She's threatening a $200 fine. Let her try. I'm already fighting 3 other violations from her. My lawyer says we might have grounds for harassment." That word stuck with me. Harassment. Patricia had been HOA president for 2 years, and in that time, she'd issued more violation notices than the previous 3 presidents combined. The neighborhood Facebook group was full of complaints about her, but nobody seemed willing to actually do anything about it. I spent the rest of the afternoon stewing about it. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. It wasn't just the snow pile. It was the principle. I'd paid good money for this house. I paid my HOA dues every month without fail, and I kept my property in excellent condition. And here was Patricia, drunk on her tiny amount of power, making my life miserable over something as temporary and harmless as a snow pile. By evening, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to move the snow to my backyard. That would be admitting that Patricia was right, that her insane interpretation of the bylaws was reasonable. But I also didn't want to just pay the fine and let her win. I needed to make a point, and it needed to be a point she couldn't ignore. The idea came to me around 9 o'clock that night, as I was scrolling through the HOA bylaws on my laptop. I found the section about the HOA office, which was located in a small building at the entrance to our subdivision. The building sat on what the bylaws referred to as common area property, which meant it belonged to all the homeowners collectively, not to Patricia personally or to the HOA board specifically. I read further and found section 12.7. Common area properties are maintained for the use and benefit of all homeowners within Meadowbrook Estates and shall remain accessible to all residents in accordance with posted hours and regulations. A slow grin spread across my face. If the HOA office was common property, and if Patricia was so concerned about where snow was placed on private property, then perhaps I should relocate my snow to common property instead. Specifically, right against the front door of the HOA office where she worked 3 days a week. I knew it was petty. I knew it would make her absolutely furious. But after 3 years of her endless nitpicking and power trips, I was done playing nice. The next morning I woke up at 5:30, before sunrise. I dressed in my warmest clothes, grabbed my snow shovel and headed outside. The violation notice had said I had 24 hours to relocate the snow, and I was going to beat that deadline by relocating it exactly where I wanted it. My driveway was about 100 feet from the HOA office building. It would take multiple trips, but I was motivated. I started with the shovel, filling up a large plastic storage bin I used for yard waste, then dragging it down the sidewalk toward the HOA building. The streets were quiet at this hour. A few people were starting their cars to warm them up, but nobody paid me much attention. Just another homeowner dealing with snow removal. Nothing unusual about that. It took me 45 minutes to move the first 6 bins worth of snow. I piled it directly in front of the HOA office door, packing it tight against the frame. The building was a small brick structure with a single glass door and 2 windows flanking it. By the time I'd moved half of my snow pile, the door was completely blocked, buried under at least 3 feet of packed snow. I was sweating despite the freezing temperature, my arms aching from the repetitive shoveling and dragging. But I kept going. Every shovelful of snow I moved felt like a small victory, a tiny rebellion against Patricia's tyranny. By 8 o'clock, I'd relocated the entire pile. The front of the HOA office looked like an avalanche had hit it. Snow was piled 5 feet high against the door and spilling across the small porch area. There was no way anyone was getting in through that entrance without serious digging. I stood back to admire my work, breathing hard, steam rising from my body in the cold morning air. My driveway was now completely clear, not a speck of snow anywhere near it. I'd technically complied with the violation notice. The snow was no longer on my property in a non-approved location. It was now on common property, and unless there was a bylaw specifically prohibiting snow placement in front of the HOA office, Patricia couldn't say a word. I went home, showered, made breakfast, and waited. The call came at 9:15. Franklin Morrison. Patricia's voice was so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "What do you think you're doing?" "Good morning, Patricia," I said calmly. "I'm having breakfast. How are you?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about. You piled snow in front of the HOA office." "I did," I confirmed. "Your violation notice said I had to relocate the snow from my driveway to an approved location. The HOA office sits on common area property, which belongs to all homeowners, including me. I figured that was the most appropriate place." "That is not what the bylaw means, and you know it." "Actually, Patricia, the bylaw says snow must be placed in areas not visible from street view or in rear yard areas. It doesn't specify that common property is off limits. In fact, Section 12.7 says common property is for the use and benefit of all homeowners. I'm a homeowner. I'm using it." I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice was lower but shaking with rage. "You remove that snow immediately or I will call the police." "On what grounds? I haven't broken any laws." "If you think I've violated an HOA bylaw, you're welcome to issue me another violation notice. But I should warn you, if you do, I'll be filing a formal complaint with the HOA board about harassment. I've documented every violation notice you've issued to me over the past 3 years, and I think the board will find the pattern pretty interesting." There was a long silence. Then she hung up. I finished my breakfast feeling pretty good about myself. Maybe it was childish, but standing up to Patricia felt better than I'd expected. The good feeling lasted until about noon, when I received an email from the HOA board requesting my presence at an emergency meeting that evening at 7 o'clock. The email was formal and didn't specify what the meeting was about, but I had a pretty good idea. I called Greg again. "Hey, you know anything about HOA law?" "A little." "Why?" I explained what I'd done. He was silent for a moment, then burst out laughing. "Oh man, Franklin, that's brilliant. Patricia must be losing her mind." She called me screaming. "Now the board wants to meet with me tonight." "You need to be careful," Greg said, his tone becoming more serious. "The board can fine you, put a lien on your house if you don't pay, even take you to court. Patricia's got most of them in her pocket. What do you suggest?" "Document everything. Bring copies of all the violation notices she's given you. Bring a copy of the bylaws, and if they try to fine you, demand to see exactly which bylaw you violated. Make them put it in writing." I spent the afternoon preparing. I printed out every email and violation notice Patricia had sent me over 3 years. I highlighted relevant sections of the HOA bylaws. I even did some research on Colorado HOA law and found several cases where courts had ruled against HOAs for overreach and harassment. At 6:45, I walked over to the HOA office. Someone had cleared the snow from the front door, though large piles of it still sat on either side of the entrance. Inside, the building was small and overheated. The main room had a few chairs, a desk with a computer, and a back room that served as a meeting space. Patricia was already there along with the 4 other board members. I recognized them all from neighborhood events. There was Robert Chen, a retired accountant who lived on Maple Street, Susan Brennan, a real estate agent in her 50s, Marcus Walker, a software engineer who rarely spoke at meetings, and Dorothy Sheffield, an elderly woman who'd lived in Meadowbrook Estate since it was built 15 years ago. Patricia sat at the head of the table, her arms crossed, her expression thunderous. The others looked uncomfortable, like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Morrison," Patricia began, her voice tight and controlled, "thank you for coming. We need to discuss your actions this morning." "You mean relocating my snow as per your violation notice?" I said, taking a seat. "You know exactly what I mean. You deliberately piled snow in front of this office, blocking the entrance and preventing the HOA from conducting business. I relocated snow from my property to common area property, which I have every right to use as a homeowner. The violation notice you issued required me to move the snow within 24 hours. I complied." Robert cleared his throat. "Franklin, I think we can all agree that while you may have technically complied with the letter of the notice, you didn't comply with the spirit of it." "With all due respect, Robert, the spirit of the notice seemed to be making my life difficult over something completely harmless. I had a snow pile on the edge of my driveway. It wasn't blocking anything. It wasn't hurting anyone. It was going to melt in a few days. And Patricia decided to fine me $200 for it." "The bylaws are clear," Patricia snapped. "Snow must be placed in approved locations." "Show me where in the bylaws it says common property isn't an approved location," I said. I pulled out my printed copy of the bylaws. "Section 12.7 says common property is for the use and benefit of all homeowners. I'm a homeowner. I used it." Dorothy spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "Patricia, dear, I have to say, I think Franklin has a point. That bylaw about snow placement always seemed a bit excessive to me. It's winter in Colorado. Snow happens. The bylaws exist to maintain property values and community standards," Patricia said. "If we let people pile snow wherever they want, the neighborhood will look like a disaster." "My snow pile was on the edge of my driveway, barely visible from the street," I said. "And frankly, Patricia, I think this is about more than snow. This is about you abusing your position as HOA president to harass homeowners you don't like." Her face went red. "How dare you? I have documentation," I interrupted, pulling out my folder. 37 violation notices over 3 years. 37. For things like my garbage cans being visible for 20 minutes too long, my grass being half an inch too tall, my car facing the wrong direction in my own driveway. I've talked to other neighbors. I'm not the only one. Greg Hartman has received over 50 notices. The Johnsons have gotten 42. Meanwhile, I've noticed that your friends in the neighborhood seem to get away with all sorts of violations. Susan, didn't you have Christmas lights up until March last year? Susan looked uncomfortable. I had been meaning to take those down. The point is, I continued, there's a pattern here. Patricia uses violation notices as a weapon against people she doesn't like while ignoring violations from her friends. That's not enforcing bylaws. That's harassment. Marcus, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. I've actually been concerned about this too. Patricia, you've issued 3 times as many violations as any previous HOA president. Some of the neighbors have started calling you the violation queen. Patricia's jaw tightened. I'm simply doing my job. If people followed the rules, they wouldn't get violations. But which rules? I pressed. There are 70 pages of bylaws, half of them so vague or specific that it's impossible to avoid violating them, and you seem to interpret them in whatever way suits you at the moment. Robert sighed. This meeting is getting off track. Franklin, the issue at hand is the snow you placed in front of this building. That was clearly an act of retaliation, and it disrupted HOA business. Was anyone actually prevented from doing business? The building has a back entrance. And the snow was cleared within a few hours anyway. Meanwhile, Patricia's violation notice threatened me with a $200 fine for something that would have naturally resolved itself within days. If we're talking about proportionate responses, I think my point has been made. There was a long silence. Dorothy finally spoke again. I move that we rescind the violation notice issued to Mr. Morrison regarding snow placement. The bylaw in question is poorly worded and, frankly, unreasonable. People shouldn't be fined for where they put snow during a blizzard. Second, Marcus said immediately. Patricia looked like she was about to explode. You can't be serious. He blocked our office. And you've blocked half the neighborhood from enjoying their own properties with your constant violation notices, Dorothy said. I've been on this board since the beginning, Patricia, and I've watched you turn this HOA into your personal fiefdom. It stops now. Robert looked between them, clearly torn. Susan stared at the table. All in favor of rescinding the violation notice? Dorothy asked. Dorothy and Marcus raised their hands immediately. After a moment, Susan raised hers too. Robert hesitated, then slowly raised his. Patricia stood up so fast her chair fell over backward. Fine. This board clearly doesn't appreciate my dedication to maintaining standards. But mark my words, Franklin Morrison, you haven't heard the last of this. She grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door behind her hard enough to rattle the windows. The remaining board members looked at each other awkwardly. Well, Dorothy said, that went better than expected. I couldn't help but laugh. Is she always like that? Worse, usually, Marcus said. Look, Franklin, I apologize. A lot of us have been frustrated with Patricia for a while, but she's hard to remove. She knows the bylaws inside and out, and she's always technically following procedure, even when she's being completely unreasonable. What happens now? I asked. Robert rubbed his face. Honestly, I don't know. Patricia's term as president doesn't end until next year. We could call for a vote of no confidence, but that requires a petition from 20% of homeowners, and most people don't want to get involved. Maybe this is the push they need, Susan suggested. Franklin, would you be willing to help organize a petition? I think a lot of people would support it if they knew others were too. I thought about it. I'd never been particularly involved in neighborhood politics. I just wanted to live my life in peace. But Patricia had made that impossible, and if she was making everyone else miserable too, maybe it was time someone did something about it. Yeah, I said. I'll help. Over the next few weeks, I became more involved in neighborhood affairs than I'd ever planned. I created a Facebook group for homeowners who were frustrated with the HOA's management. Within 3 days, it had over 100 members. People shared their stories about ridiculous violation notices, excessive fines, and Patricia's general attitude problem. Greg became my co-organizer. Together, we drafted a petition calling for Patricia's removal as HOA president, citing abuse of power, harassment, and failure to act in the best interests of the community. We needed signatures from 74 homeowners, which was 20% of the 370 homes in Meadowbrook Estates. We got 93 signatures in 2 weeks. During this time, Patricia didn't stay quiet. She issued more violation notices, seemingly at random. My mailbox suddenly wasn't the right shade of black, even though it had been the same mailbox for 3 years. Greg got written up for having a wreath on his door past Valentine's Day. The Johnsons were fined because their house numbers weren't properly visible, despite being clearly displayed on their mailbox. But this time, people fought back. Almost everyone who received a notice filed a formal complaint with the HOA board. The board was overwhelmed. Robert called me one evening, sounding exhausted. "Franklin, we need to move up the vote. Patricia's out of control. She issued 23 violation notices yesterday alone." 23? We can't keep up with the complaints and appeals. "When do you want to do it?" I asked. "This Saturday." "We'll call an emergency general meeting. With the petition and all these complaints, I think we have grounds to remove her immediately." That Saturday, the clubhouse at the neighborhood park was packed. Nearly 200 homeowners showed up, which was unheard of for an HOA meeting. Usually, these things drew maybe 20 people at most. Patricia arrived exactly on time, dressed in a stiff business suit, her expression defiant. She sat at the front table with the other board members, her arms crossed, saying nothing. Robert called the meeting to order and explained the situation. He read out the petition and summarized the complaints that had been filed. Then he opened the floor for discussion. What followed was 2 hours of homeowners standing up and sharing their experiences with Patricia's management. Some stories were almost funny, like the guy who got fined because his lawn ornament was considered too whimsical for the neighborhood's aesthetic. Others were genuinely concerning, like the elderly couple who'd been threatened with legal action because they couldn't afford to repaint their house in the middle of winter. Through it all, Patricia sat silent, her face getting redder and redder. Finally, Robert called for a vote. The motion was simple: remove Patricia Whitmore as HOA president, effective immediately, and appoint Dorothy Sheffield as interim president until proper elections could be held in 3 months. The vote was taken by show of hands. I'd never seen so many hands go up so fast. Out of the nearly 200 people present, maybe 5 voted against the motion. Patricia's removal was as close to unanimous as these things get. Robert looked relieved. The motion passes. "Patricia, effective immediately, you are removed as HOA president. You'll need to turn over all HOA property, passwords, and documents to Dorothy by Monday." Patricia stood up slowly. For a moment, I thought she might actually concede gracefully. Instead, she looked out at the crowd with pure contempt. "You're all making a huge mistake," she said. "Without proper enforcement of the bylaws, this neighborhood will fall apart. Property values will plummet. And when that happens, don't come crying to me." She grabbed her purse and walked out for the second time in a month, though this time with less door slamming and more dignified rage. The room erupted in applause. People were hugging, laughing, and celebrating like we just won the Super Bowl. Greg clapped me on the shoulder. "We did it, man. We actually did it." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. For 3 years, Patricia had been a constant source of stress, always lurking in the background, ready to issue another violation notice. And now she was gone. Dorothy took over as interim president and immediately made changes. Her first act was to suspend all pending violation notices and appeals, declaring a grace period while the board reviewed the bylaws. Her second act was to form a committee to rewrite the most problematic sections, including the notorious snow placement rule. Life in Meadowbrook Estates got noticeably better. People actually smiled and waved when you drove through the neighborhood instead of looking paranoid about potential violations. The Facebook group transformed from a complaint forum into a genuine community hub where people organized block parties and played dates. I thought that was the end of the story. I was wrong. About 6 weeks after Patricia's removal, I got a call from Dorothy. She sounded worried. "Franklin, we have a problem. Patricia never turned over the HOA's financial records. She gave us the passwords and some documents, but Robert's been going through the books and there are some serious discrepancies." "What kind of discrepancies?" "Money missing. A lot of money. Robert thinks it could be over $30,000. I felt my stomach drop. "Are you saying Patricia was stealing from the HOA? "We don't know yet. It could be poor record keeping. But given everything else, we need to investigate. Robert wants to hire a forensic accountant." "I'm calling to give you a heads up because you were instrumental in removing her. If this turns into a legal matter, it could get messy." It got messy. The forensic accountant Robert hired spent 3 weeks going through 5 years of HOA financial records. What he found was damning. Patricia had been systematically embezzling money from the HOA for at least 4 years. She'd done it cleverly, using violation fines and special assessments that she'd pocket instead of depositing into the HOA account. She'd also inflated costs for neighborhood maintenance, paying contractors for work that was never done and keeping the difference. The total amount stolen was just over $42,000. The board had no choice but to involve the police. Detective Sarah Kim from the Denver Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit took over the investigation. She interviewed board members, reviewed the accountant's findings, and eventually obtained a warrant to search Patricia's home. I wasn't there for the search, but Greg's wife worked for the police department in an administrative capacity, and word filtered back through the neighborhood grapevine. They found cash, lots of it, hidden in various places around Patricia's house. They also found detailed records Patricia had kept, apparently thinking she'd never get caught. She documented every fraudulent transaction, probably for tax purposes or to keep track of her schemes. Patricia was arrested on a Thursday morning. I happened to be driving past her house when the police cars pulled up. I watched from my car as Detective Kim walked Patricia out in handcuffs, loading her into the back of a police cruiser. Patricia's husband stood on the front porch, looking shell-shocked. The news spread through the neighborhood instantly. People couldn't believe it. The woman who'd been so obsessed with enforcing petty rules had been a criminal the entire time. Patricia was charged with embezzlement, theft, and fraud. Her lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor's office wasn't interested in going easy on her. The case went to trial 6 months later. I was called as a witness, along with dozens of other homeowners. We testified about the excessive violation notices, the fines we'd paid, and Patricia's general behavior as HOA president. The prosecution argued that Patricia had used her position of power to create a climate of fear, making homeowners afraid to question her authority while she robbed them blind. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge sentenced Patricia to 5 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA, plus additional fines and penalties. Her husband, who apparently had no knowledge of her crimes, filed for divorce within weeks of the verdict. Meadowbrook Estates had to rebuild its HOA from the ground up. Dorothy stayed on as president and did an excellent job, but she insisted it would only be temporary. Proper elections were held, and Marcus won, running on a platform of transparency and common sense enforcement of reasonable rules. The bylaws were completely rewritten. The new version was 20 pages instead of 70, with clear, straightforward rules that actually made sense. The snow placement rule was eliminated entirely, replaced with a simple requirement to keep sidewalks clear for pedestrian safety. The recovered money from Patricia, combined with insurance payouts, was used to fund neighborhood improvements that had been neglected for years. We got new playground equipment, repaved several streets, and installed better lighting at the park. As for me, I went back to my quiet life. I'd never wanted to be a neighborhood activist or HOA reformer, but sometimes circumstances force you into roles you never expected. The whole experience taught me that standing up to petty tyrants, even when it seems pointless, can actually make a real difference. The snow pile that started it all became something of a neighborhood legend. At the first community BBQ after Patricia's arrest, someone even made a snow cone machine and set up a booth called Franklin's Revenge, serving snow cones in her honor. It was silly, but it felt good to laugh about something that had caused so much stress. Greg and I became close friends through the whole ordeal. We started a tradition of having coffee every Saturday morning, talking about everything except HOA business. His lawsuit against Patricia for harassment had been dropped once the criminal charges were filed, since it seemed redundant at that point. One morning, about a year after everything had settled down, Greg and I were sitting on my back porch, enjoying the cool spring weather. The snow had long since melted, and my yard was green and peaceful. You ever think about what would have happened if you just moved the snow to your backyard? Greg asked. I laughed. Probably nothing. Patricia would have kept being Patricia, and we'd all still be miserable. Sometimes being petty is the right move, he said. Sometimes standing up for yourself, even in small ways, opens doors you didn't know were there, I replied. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching birds flit around the bird feeder I'd installed, which was definitely not HOA approved under the old bylaws but perfectly fine under the new ones. The legal proceedings had taken their toll on Patricia's family in ways beyond just her imprisonment. Her daughter, who I'd met a few times at neighborhood events, moved out of state to escape the stigma. The house went into foreclosure when Patricia's husband couldn't afford the mortgage on his single income, combined with the restitution payments. A young couple with twins bought it at auction and became beloved members of the community almost immediately. Meanwhile, the HOA continued to evolve. Marcus implemented an online portal where homeowners could submit maintenance requests, pay dues, and communicate with the board. Everything was transparent, with financial reports published quarterly. The change in culture was remarkable, but the story wasn't quite finished. About 18 months after Patricia's sentencing, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Patricia herself, writing from the Colorado Women's Correctional Facility. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was surprisingly short, and to my genuine shock, appeared to be a sincere apology. She wrote about how prison had given her time to reflect on her actions, how she'd let her need for control spiral into something destructive, and how she'd rationalized the theft by convincing herself she deserved compensation for all her hard work. She acknowledged the pain she'd caused and said she didn't expect forgiveness but wanted me to know she was genuinely sorry. I showed the letter to Greg. He read it twice, then handed it back with a shrug. "What do you think? Is it real?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe. Prison changes people, or so they say. But honestly, it doesn't really matter to me. She made her choices. She's facing the consequences. Whether she's sorry or not doesn't change what happened." "Are you going to write back?" "No," I said, and I felt certain about it. "That chapter's closed." I don't need her apology to move on, because I've already moved on. I filed the letter away in a drawer and forgot about it. The second winter after the snow pile incident was much calmer. When the first big storm hit, dumping another 18 inches on Denver, I cleared my driveway and piled the snow exactly where I wanted, which happened to be at the edge of my driveway where it was most convenient. Nobody said a word. Nobody cared. It was just snow. Marcus did send out a reminder email about keeping sidewalks clear for safety, which was reasonable and necessary. Several homeowners, including me, volunteered to help clear sidewalks for elderly neighbors who couldn't manage it themselves. The neighborhood actually came together and helped each other, which seemed like a revolutionary concept after years of Patricia's divisive management. One thing that surprised me was how many people thanked me personally for standing up to Patricia. At the grocery store, at neighborhood events, even just walking my dog, people would stop me and share their own stories about how miserable she'd made them. Some had been planning to sell their homes just to escape the constant harassment. Others had simply felt powerless, trapped in a system that seemed designed to make them fail. The most touching moment came from Dorothy, about 2 years after everything settled. We were at a neighborhood planning meeting, discussing whether to install a community garden. After the meeting ended and most people had left, Dorothy pulled me aside. "Franklin, I wanted to tell you something," she said. "My husband and I were seriously considering moving before you took on Patricia. He has health issues, and the stress of her constant violations was making him worse. We couldn't afford to fight her legally, and we couldn't afford to keep paying fines. When you organized that petition, you saved our home. I mean that literally. So thank you." I felt a lump in my throat. "I just didn't want to move my snow to my backyard," I said, trying to lighten the moment. She smiled. Sometimes the smallest acts of rebellion lead to the biggest changes. The community garden was approved, by the way. It became a huge success, with over 30 families participating. Kids learned about growing vegetables. Neighbors bonded over shared harvests, and the whole thing fostered a sense of community that had been completely absent during Patricia's reign. I even started volunteering for the HOA's Architectural Review Committee, which approved or denied requests for home modifications. It was ironic, given my history with violation notices, but I wanted to make sure the committee operated fairly. We approved almost everything that wasn't genuinely problematic, focusing on safety and maintaining property values without unnecessary restrictions. One homeowner wanted to paint his house bright purple. The old board would have rejected it instantly. Our committee discussed it, looked at examples he provided, and ultimately approved a deep eggplant purple that was unique without being garish. The neighborhood had some character now, some personality. It felt more like a community than a sterile subdivision. The transformation affected me personally too. Before the snow pile incident, I'd been pretty isolated. I went to work, came home, and kept to myself. I knew my immediate neighbors by sight but rarely interacted with anyone. Fighting Patricia's tyranny had forced me to engage with the community, and I discovered I actually enjoyed it. I started hosting BBQs in the summer, inviting neighbors over. I joined the Neighborhood Watch program. I even coached a youth soccer team, something I'd never have considered before. The whole experience had brought me out of my shell and shown me the value of community involvement. Greg often joked that Patricia had accidentally done us all a favor by being so terrible. If she'd been just mildly annoying, we might have tolerated it indefinitely. But her extremism had forced us to act, and the result was a much healthier, happier community. There were still challenges, of course. HOAs exist for a reason, and managing a neighborhood of 370 homes is complex. We had disputes about noise complaints, disagreements about how to spend HOA funds, and the occasional homeowner who genuinely did create problems that needed to be addressed. But these were normal problems, handled by reasonable people trying to find fair solutions. It was nothing like the constant fear and frustration of Patricia's rule. 3 years after the initial snow pile incident, Meadowbrook Estates was rated as one of the most desirable neighborhoods in Denver by a local real estate publication. Property values had increased by an average of 12%, not despite the relaxed HOA enforcement, but likely because of it. Turns out people want to live in places where they're treated like adults, not children who need constant supervision. I still lived in the same house, though I'd made several improvements over the years. I'd added a deck to the back, upgraded the kitchen, and installed solar panels on the roof. All of these projects were approved quickly and without hassle by the Architectural Review Committee. It was almost shocking how easy things could be when people weren't actively trying to make them difficult. One evening in late December, almost exactly 3 years after I'd piled snow against the HOA office door, I was sitting on that new deck with a glass of whiskey, watching the sunset. It had snowed the night before, just a few inches, enough to make everything look clean and peaceful. My phone rang. It was Marcus. "Hey Franklin, got a question for you. How would you feel about running for HOA president in the next election?" I nearly dropped my whiskey. "What? No. Absolutely not. Come on, hear me out. You'd be great at it. Everyone respects you, you understand the bylaws, and you actually care about the community." "Marcus, I appreciate the confidence, but I took on Patricia because I had to. I'm not a leader. I'm just a guy who didn't want to move his snow," he laughed. "That's exactly why you'd be perfect. You understand that the HOA should be a tool to help the community, not a weapon to control it. Just think about it, okay?" After he hung up, I sat there thinking. The idea was absurd. I'd never wanted any kind of power or authority. But then again, I'd never wanted to organize a petition or testify in a criminal trial either. Sometimes life pushes you in unexpected directions. In the end, I didn't run for president, but I did agree to stay on the Architectural Review Committee and join the board as a regular member. It was enough involvement to make a difference without consuming my life. Patricia was released from prison after serving 3.5 years of her 5-year sentence, getting out early for good behavior. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved to Arizona to live with her sister. Good for her, I thought. Arizona was far away, and I hoped she'd found some peace and perspective. I never saw or heard from her again, which was fine with me. Looking back on the whole saga, from that first ridiculous violation notice to the trial and everything after, I realized how much I'd grown as a person. I'd learned to stand up for myself and others. I'd discovered the importance of community. I'd made real friends and turned a hostile environment into a genuine neighborhood, and it all started because I refused to move a pile of snow. The lesson, if there was one, wasn't about HOAs specifically, though the experience certainly taught me a lot about how they should and shouldn't operate. The real lesson was about the importance of standing up to injustice, even when it seems petty or pointless. Patricia's $200 fine over snow placement seemed like such a minor thing. It would have been easy to just pay it, to comply and move on, to keep my head down and avoid confrontation. But that fine represented something bigger. An abuse of power, a system that had gone wrong, a leader who had lost sight of her responsibility to serve the community. By refusing to accept that injustice, even in its smallest form, I'd accidentally sparked a change that improved hundreds of lives. Not just by removing Patricia, though that was important, but by showing people that they didn't have to accept unreasonable treatment, that they had power when they worked together, and that communities function better when they're built on mutual respect rather than fear and control. The snow had melted long ago, but the impact of that simple act of defiance remained. Every time I drove through the neighborhood and saw people actually enjoying their homes, not worried about arbitrary violation notices, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Every time the HOA board made a reasonable decision that prioritized community well-being over rigid rule enforcement, I remembered why it had all been worthwhile. I never became a neighborhood celebrity or anything dramatic like that. Most of the newer residents didn't even know the full story. To them, I was just Franklin, the guy who lived on Oak Street, who brought good beer to block parties and helped jump-start your car when your battery died in winter. But the people who'd been there, who'd lived through Patricia's reign and witnessed the transformation, they remembered. And that was enough. On the 4th anniversary of the snow pile incident, Greg organized a small gathering at his house with about a dozen of the key people who'd been involved in everything. We grilled burgers, told stories, and laughed about how absurd it all seemed in retrospect. Somebody, I think it was Susan from the board, raised her glass and proposed a toast to Franklin, who taught us that sometimes the most important battles are fought over the smallest things. Everyone cheered, and I felt my face go red with embarrassment. But I raised my glass too, because she was right in a way. The snow pile wasn't really about snow. It was about dignity, respect, and refusing to let petty tyrants make you feel small. As the evening wound down and people started heading home, Greg and I stood in his driveway looking up at the stars. It was a clear winter night, cold but beautiful. "You ever regret it?" Greg asked. "Getting involved, I mean. You could have just paid the fine." I thought about it seriously, considering all the stress, time, and energy I'd invested over the years. Then I thought about Dorothy and her husband, who'd been able to stay in their home, about the families who were no longer living in fear of violation notices, about the kids playing in the improved park with new equipment, about the community garden where neighbors actually talked to each other like friends. "No," I said. "I don't regret any of it," he nodded, satisfied. "Good, because you really did make a difference, man. Never forget that." I drove home slowly, enjoying the peaceful streets of Meadowbrook Estates. My house was warm and welcoming, my driveway was clear, and there were no violation notices waiting for me in the mailbox. Life was good, and a pile of snow had somehow made it that way. Strange how things work out sometimes. As I settled into bed that night, I thought about Patricia one last time, not with anger or satisfaction about her downfall, but with something closer to pity. She'd had power and authority, a position where she could have genuinely helped people and made the community better. Instead, she'd let her ego and greed corrupt her, and she'd lost everything because of it. There was a lesson there too, though not for me. I'd learned mine already, standing in my driveway at 5:30 in the morning, moving snow one shovelful at a time, refusing to be bullied. Sometimes you have to make a stand, even if it seems ridiculous. Sometimes you have to pile your snow exactly where it makes your point. And sometimes, just sometimes, that act of petty rebellion changes everything. I fell asleep smiling, thinking about snow piles and community gardens and the strange, winding path that had led from one to the other. 4 years ago, I'd been a guy who just wanted to be left alone. Now I was someone who understood that being part of a community meant sometimes fighting for it, protecting it, and yes, occasionally piling snow where it would cause the most dramatic effect. And I wouldn't change a single thing about it. The Meadowbrook Estates I lived in now was nothing like the fearful, oppressed neighborhood it had been under Patricia's rule. It was vibrant, friendly, and genuinely pleasant. People chose to follow the rules because they made sense, not because they were afraid of arbitrary enforcement. The HOA served the community instead of ruling over it, all because one day I decided I wasn't going to move my snow to my backyard, and instead I was going to make a point. The best kind of point, the kind that changes everything while being absolutely, gloriously petty. As I drifted off to sleep, my last thought was simple. Sometimes the most important act of rebellion is refusing to comply with unreasonable demands, even when it would be easier to just give in. That's how tyrants are defeated, one small refusal at a time, until their power crumbles like snow melting in the spring sun. And that, really, was the end of it. The story of how an HOA fine over a snow pile location led to uncovering embezzlement, imprisoning a tyrant, and rebuilding a community into something actually worth being part of. It sounded absurd when you put it that way, but every word was true. The snow had done its work. The rest was just us, the people of Meadowbrook Estates, learning to be a real community instead of a collection of houses ruled by fear. And that was the best ending I could have asked for.